Welcome to the Center Collaborative, Creative Solutions in Behavioral Health and Criminal Justice, brought to you by the Oregon Center on Behavioral Health and Justice Integration, which is also known as the Center. We at the Center are all about solutions. Our job in Oregon is to facilitate improvement of the system so behavioral health and criminal justice can work better together to engage people in treatment while promoting public safety. I am your host, Chris Thomas. I hold a master's degree in clinical psychology and have focused on the intersection between behavioral health and criminal justice for 20 years. Over 7 of those years were behind the walls of a maximum security prison. During this podcast, you will have the opportunity to sit in on real, in-depth conversations with experts about complex topics in a way that is both fascinating and digestible. We will focus not just on what is wrong with the system, but what is going right and how we can work together to evolve. In this episode of the podcast, which is part 1 of a 2-part series, I am joined by Ari Wagner, Chief Operating Officer for Greater Oregon Behavioral Health Incorporated, GOBHI, and the Director of Operations, which is the department the center is under. We discuss her role as the first juvenile justice researcher in Oregon and her significant role in determining the recidivism rate for juvenile offenders and the development of a risk assessment tool to help determine the placement within the system. We also talk about how the juvenile justice system is not a miniature version of the adult system, and that a majority of the youth in the system receive treatment in the community instead of within an institution. Furthermore, we discuss how a primary goal of the juvenile justice system is preventing further penetration into the criminal justice system. We also discuss risk factors for juvenile criminal behavior and how that informs treatment. Welcome to our conversation. Ari, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you here.
I really appreciate the invitation, Chris. I've been looking forward to talking with you.
Ari, we're not known for our work within the juvenile system. We're known for most of our work within the adult system. And we're going to talk a little bit about the work that GOBHI and the center does around the juvenile system. I wanted to start off talking with you about what your pathway was in your work with juvenile justice, how you got started with this work.
Well, it's a fun place to start for me because it was a pretty rich path to getting there. I'll just try to condense it for you, though, as a backdrop to our conversation, Chris. I've had the incredible, fortunate experience of having my interests, my skills be in the right place and the right time with the right leadership. And so that started in a weird point, in undergraduate work in college. My undergrad is in social work. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it, right? So I had all these ideas like you do when you're in college, trying to figure out what do I want to be here when I'm done with my student loans. And so I knew one thing, Chris. My whole life had been important for me to be involved in work that provides service to the community and helps vulnerable populations. And I had a very strong affinity towards helping teenagers. There was just something always in me. So I knew that about myself. But in college, how did that work? Was I going to be a counselor? Was I going to work in a hospital setting? Was I going to work with juveniles? I thought about end-of-life care. There was even a point where I thought about being a mortician. And so you can see I was just all over the map. And of course, being a great avid watcher of scary movies, I knew that wasn't going to be a life course for me. So I'm just like, what am I going to do? And of course, what helps you figure that out in undergrad? Internships. So I chose my internship and was selected for the position with the South Phoenix Youth Center in Phoenix, Arizona, which was right next to South Mountain High School. So every day between 150 and 300 teenagers would come over to the center right after school. And there was probably 7 to 11 staff there to help manage that. 10% of the kids were involved in gangs. It was really catching on in Phoenix in the early 80s, which is about the time I'm talking about here. And the rest of the youth there were somehow affected by it. So it was a huge issue, which means my internship in social work was involved in trying to break up fights and take guns away from people and talk to people who were in really precarious situations in life. And I got a grant while I was there. and was the substance abuse prevention coordinator. So I was doing a lot with the youth around substance abuse prevention. And at that time, there wasn't a really clear model for proving that prevention works. So I got to be involved in helping set that up. And at the time, the center director was Cynthia Lee. So I'm in the right place. It's a really exciting opportunity. Someone who's supporting me a lot. All these open opportunities to work with young people. I just, really, really loved it. And as much as that engaged in my research side of my brain, it was really the heart side, humanity side that just loved what I did. These young people taught me more about myself because, as teenagers hold a mirror to you. And when you're working with teenagers who are primarily of a race, ethnicity that's not what I was born into, that's an even stronger mirror. Caused me to look at a lot of things about my beliefs I had as growing up. And I just really, really loved it. And the things we got to do with the young people there was like get some vans and go down to Mexico for a weekend and show them what that was like, and go to Disneyland for a weekend and take them up to the mountains and the lake in Arizona and see for the first time being outside the city, having conversations about decision making and values and peer pressure and why we pick different paths in life. And of course, when you're with 30 teenagers and 3 staff up in the mountains, you start to worry about the night being a little bit precarious, right? Like, what kind of shenanigans are they going to get into for their first time in the mountains, with 3 adults watching over, or quasi adults, I should say. We were young adults then. So just to give you an idea of some of the thinking that led into my career development, Chris, so we brought a TV with us and a VHS movie of Crystal Lake and Jason, and we showed that at night with the 15, 30 kids by the lake, and we told them we were at Crystal Lake, and nobody left the cabins at night, right? And
That was very trauma informed, Ari.
yeah, very informed. And the 3 staff were afraid to go out too. So what happened was we all had a big joke and all very vulnerable and showing that sides of each other. And probably that authenticity was my best connection with young people and working with them. And it was fun. You go to housing developments after work for a night conversation about substance abuse and prevention. And we would have potlucks that parents would come to. And I'd pull into the parking lot, and really young kids would run up to me and say, "Hey, you want to buy something here?" And they think I was there to buy drugs. And here's this little white lady showing up there and must want drugs. And they'd see me and they'd say, "Oh, you're the drug prevention lady." And I'd say, "Yeah, I am. Are you coming to the meeting tonight?" And they'd be like, "Well, are you bringing the pizzas?" So I started to just get more accepted and brought into the families' lives there, invited to homes, and it was just amazing. I just absolutely loved it. Just found a niche there that I thought I was giving something, but in the end, I was learning more about life and things that really mattered from doing that work. And some of those youth went on, of course, to go on to college, into the military, other kinds of jobs. Some left this earth too early. They died from gang violence, substance abuse, drug overdose, suicide. A couple of kids died of AIDS related illnesses. It was the most empowering, poignant, and harshly sad experience to have, and connections with people while you're trying to figure out your life career. So at that time, I observed something else. I noticed that people who make decisions and policies and rules that affected those young people in that community, I didn't really see them there talking to the kids very much, or the families. It seemed really removed to me. So I'm sure they were good people and good intentions and, really dedicated to their work. But I just thought, oh man, those policies make such a difference here. I want to be at that table with the suits. That's what we used to call them. I want to be at the table with the suits so I can help make decisions that impact more than individuals, but systems. This whole neighborhood was really something that I hooked into. So I went on to get my graduate work at the University of Oregon, which caused a big riff, of course, because My family's all in Arizona, and I'm a loyal Duck fan. But it's a great rivalry from what happened in me leaving. So in my graduate work in planning, public policy, and management, again, good place, good time, right leadership. My mentor, Dr. Ed Weeks, was really encouraging of the things I wanted to do and the studies I was interested in, focusing in research. And a job came open at the Lane County Juvenile Department for a researcher. And I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to research, I want to influence policy, I want to help impact teenage lives, families, communities. This is the perfect job. But I hadn't finished my degree, and I thought there's no way I'll be competitive for it. And I applied anyway, and I interviewed. I got to the interview, and I was so nervous. I thought for sure I just blew the whole thing. My tongue was swollen, shaking. It didn't make any sense. I really saw this. I'm blowing my big future opportunity here. The job I'm working on my degree for is slipping through my fingers as I scramble to finish a sentence, just all that internal young adult worry chatter that goes on. Well, it turns out they were more interested in what I had to say versus how I said it, and I got the job. And what I had to say was I talked about not just having a corrections approach, but the need for treatment. And I taken what I learned in Phoenix and other areas of study in my own lives and friends' lives, and just knew that locking up alone couldn't help a person in the long run. That you needed treatment, and the more those two options were co-located, the better off the youth was going to be. So I didn't have to run all over town to get different services. What I didn't know was that the director then, Stephen Carmichael, and assistant director, Chuck Ryer, who turned out to be, again, two other amazing mentors, they were planning with Jim Forbes, who was director of a nonprofit organization in Lane County. They were planning a campus approach to juvenile justice where they would bring together a new correction facility, new education options, and treatment facilities on a campus setting, including mental health and residential treatment for substance abuse and other needs that youth have that need to be placed outside the home. But it would all be at this centralized location. So when I say just the right thinking and the right time with the right people, that's the genesis of everything I've got to be involved in. So I was hired for the position. I was the first juvenile justice researcher in a juvenile department in all of Oregon. And I attended this conference, and I went to a workshop called the 8% Problem. It was in California. Some researchers there talked about 8% of the juvenile offenders in California cause a majority of crime, and talked about the if we just focus on that youth, we can really make a difference in crime. So I thought, me, these gears are turning, and I'm so excited. And I run back and meet with all the juvenile department directors in Oregon, 36 of them, one for each county. And I say, I'm sure this is true in more than just California. Let's get a standardized definition of recidivism, reoffenses, and measure if it's true here. And then we can use that. And I'm going on and on. And you could have just heard a pin drop until the laughter hit the room. And the juvenile department directors, who I absolutely adore, I just have great respect for them, but they weren't really ready to move on the dime on this topic back in the early 90s we're at now. So they said to me, we've tried. We'll never get a standardized definition of juvenile recidivism. We see it all differently. We do our work differently. What's important here isn't important there. So there was just this monologue about how historically impossible what I was proposing was. So I took my little stubborn, persistent self and said, okay, thanks for the time. I'm going to go look for some other research. Well, what I did was I went back to Lane County, and prior to all of us having computers on the desk, so I'm really aging myself here, but it's true. I went into paper files and I manually calculated recidivism, developed a definition that I thought would work, and I manually used that definition to track how many offenders were first time, second time, and chronic offenders. And it turns out that that particular county had a 10% problem. California was 8%. So I found 10% of the offenders committed the majority of the crime. replicated the whole thing by hand.
Wow.
And so I went back to the next juvenile department directors meetings with overheads and colored charts and showing what that looked like. Of all first time offenders, here's the number that committed no new crimes over a year. Here's a number that committed one or two, and here's the number that went on to commit three or more. I decided three or more by the ways the frequency distribution in the data showed me that was the breakoff point, right? So they just sat there and I thought, what is this going to feel like? And so when I was done, they all raised their hand and said, we want you to do that for our county.
When?
Big time. It was just such a, oh my gosh moment. And again, right place, right people, my skills, right people supporting it. Just the timing was perfect. Steve and Chuck said, yeah, we'll give this time to the Juvenile Department Directors Association. We'll replicate it for every county. Barbara Selgin, who's passed since, but she was working as the researcher for the association, is going to work with her on doing this. And I said, well, first of all, we need a standardized definition of juvenile recidivism that you all agree on in order to do this research. So we met. There was probably 56 people in the room that day. I talked about what I did. We all agreed on the definition. They set up 7 of us to build a methodology, the technical application of it. So how do you track it? And that started a new era. Just started a new era in juvenile justice in Oregon. I was so honored to be such a small piece of it, right? It wasn't my original research. The folks in California and Washington, they'd been working on it, national studies, but I was able to take that and figure out how best to talk to people to get that ball rolling here. That started what was the beginning of an amazing, amazing journey in my career and in working in Oregon on reform. By that, I mean, so we can identify who that smaller group is, which is great. But it's, as I said, just the beginning of a great thing. The following steps are, if you know that's true, if you know for a county, for 36 counties, for several states, that that's a predictable group, somewhere between 5, at that time, 8 and 15%, maybe 20, as high as 20, go on to be chronic. How do you identify who's most likely to be on that track and prevent that from happening? And actually, Chris, we backed it up even further. Of all youth in the community, who's most likely to commit an offense, and how do you keep that from happening? That's community-based prevention. And for the systems view, of all those who commit a first crime, how do you know who's most likely to go on and commit 1 or 2 new offenses and prevent that from happening? And how do you know from first time, second offenders, who's most likely to become chronic and prevent that 8 to 17%? I mean, then you really start to crack the code around juvenile crime. You really start to turn tides around the impact of victimization and community harm. And then, of course, for the chronic group, those that you know who are committing multiple offenses, and these are criminal offenses. We didn't count runaways and truancy kinds of things. These are criminal offenses. For those who are chronic, how do you interrupt that and help to reduce the victimizations they create? And how do you prevent them from becoming adult offenders and career criminals? So those are the questions. And the juvenile justice system, dovetail into the system, and its evolution to get here and the timing of it matched perfectly. So I'm going to stop there with just my genesis, because it's not just mine. There's everyone who ever influenced me along the way, but my part of it was just pristine honor to be there. And then how it segues into what the system did with all of that. I'll take pause and see if you have anything just on the background and what you want to check in on before I go into the whole juvenile justice piece of it.
Well, first of all, I just want to honor and recognize your stubbornness. You're a woman after my own heart. I love that story. Out of my own curiosity, I'm wondering how much the definition of recidivism changed from the definition that you used initially to calculate it in Lane County.
No, they were very similar. They're actually very similar. What I did on that day, office with the paper files, and what we did as a group were very, very similar. We expanded it a little bit as a team. So juvenile crime can be tracked in three different ways. We look at a juvenile offender, right? And we look at the number of contacts with the police, which is a referral. And then on a referral, you can have several crimes. So you have individual referrals and then their number of offenses. And we all agreed that the referrals would be the point to track recidivism because offenses are so determined by, oh, I'm going to count every little thing today, or I'm only going to count three things. And that varied so much around the state on how law enforcement interpreted that the referral was a more solid measurement. So I had actually used the referrals, and the juvenile and the team that finalized it honed in on that too. We decided to also track offenses, but the formal report would be on referrals. So they expanded it to include everything, but kept the same measurement that I had thought of in that with my paper cuts that day.
Well, what a credit to you and your thinking, and what an honor. I didn't know that about you, Ari, and that work with recidivism and juvenile justice. That is incredible. When we're talking about identifying folks before they get into the system or who is going to be the folks that are more likely to be chronic within the system. I'm curious for our listeners if you can talk a little bit about what you would be tracking, what you would be looking for. What does that look like? What are the risk factors that one would be looking for someone who's likely to have involvement with the justice community, and then who is likely to penetrate further into the criminal justice system based upon risk factors? So I guess I'm asking for two things.
They're pretty similar. I think the traditional word of prevention, preventing youth from coming into the system, is much more difficult than of all those who are in it for the first time. How do you identify those who are going to go on? And I'll tell you why. Such a small number of juveniles become first time offenders. So you're finding of this population who's most likely to be in this very small slice of who crosses over that door, right? Some things that are common though is looking at a history of antisocial behavior. So they're committing crimes early onset, starting at 11 and 12 years old. That's a risk factor. It's not a this will absolutely lead to it, but it's saying you have a higher probability. And I should highlight, Chris, as I go through these, it's not any one of these, but it's the culmination. So I'll get to that in a minute. So history of early onset of crime, antisocial personality or thinking patterns, things like, oh, I can steal that car because the insurance pays for it. It's just an antisocial thinking, a rationale that goes on in their minds. Negative peer association is another one, really high. Juvenile offenders usually run in packs of some kind. So that's another risk factor. Family functioning and what's happening at home also puts a weight on the probability of a youth either committing their first crime or continuing. And by family functioning, I mean poor family supervision, domestic violence in the home, child abuse with the youth themselves, just a dysfunctional family environment. School and work, so having multiple failures at school, not just a bad grade every now and then, but many of them chronic truancy, being on the verge of being kicked out of school, the kinds of things are involved in leisure time, if it's social or antisocial, substance abuse. So as I name those, it's not any one that puts a youth at higher risk, but it's having several of the factors that says you're at a high probability of going on to be a chronic offender.
As I'm listening to you say that, it makes me think of when we look at risk to commit another crime, to recidivate in the adult system, and the 8 factors that are part of that model and are very similar. They seem to all hold, which I find is really, really interesting that you're seeing that in the juvenile system with the probability that someone may enter, and then the risk factors that we look at later on in the system for adult offenders on whether they have a risk to recidivate and commit another crime later in life. I think that's really interesting.
It's very, very similar, Chris. You're spot on. Very similar risks. And the research is based on not just one study, but 40 years. Dr. Latessa's work is a criminologist that consults nationally. He came to Oregon and testified in our legislature pretty often as we were doing reform on types of services for adults and youth. And his research was based on over 40 years of different studies that he did a meta-analysis on and showed what consistently led to increased crime and what consistently led to reducing crime. And so what we did with that information, I had mentioned Barb Selgin's name, also Juliet Mackin with Northwest Professional Consortium, which is a private research organization that was helping out the juvenile department directors. So we got together a technical group and we actually developed a tool, an assessment tool that's used at intake when juveniles are brought into the system to try to identify, are they low, medium, or high risk to reoffend. So if I could give you an example, is this a good time to do that, Chris?
Oh, absolutely.
So that group that I had mentioned got together and developed the Oregon Juvenile Department Directors Association risk assessment tool. And we based it on the research, the national research, and those risk factors you and I just talked about, and a few more that I'll talk about in a minute. So out of the 25 points that you could get on this, if a juvenile had a score of 4, they answered yes to 4 of those risk areas on the tool, they would have about a 25% probability of reoffending over the next year. If they answered yes to 9, they'd have a 50-50. So in other words, so far the tool isn't very helpful. I mean, you could flip a coin and be as successful in trying to figure out who's going to go on to be chronic. But if they answer yes to 14 questions, they have a 75% probability that they're going to reoffend in the next year. And if they answer yes to 18 or more, that probability goes up almost to 100%.
Oh, wow.
It's truly amazing. It's truly amazing. I don't know how much I know you work with the adult risk tools, so you've seen that. Probability tools, if they have like a 65 to 70% accuracy, it's a good tool. This goes up to 75, 80, 95, depending on how much information. You need to continue to revise it as they move through the system. So now you know if you're looking at someone who you're not quite sure about or seems very, very low risk versus someone that all the data is telling you, buckle up, we're going to be with this young person for a long time. Now, human nature is beyond any tool we ever have. So 10% of the time, you're going to have someone who scores low risk and they're not. They go on to commit more crimes. 10% of the time, you're going to have someone who scores high risk and they're not. So we don't have a response of like the court would, well, we think you're going to be high risk, so you get this. You can't do that. You have to base criminal responses and court responses based on what you've actually done, not what we think you're going to do. Thank goodness.
Right.
But it does help us know there's a high probability that they are going to reoffend and hurt someone else in the community or another business or groups of people. So what are these risk factors in place? And now they're on the tool. And what of these risk factors can we address? So early onset of crime, if they started committing a crime when they were 11 or 12 years old, we can't jump in our DeLorean and go back and change that. It's an unchangeable risk factor. But risk factors like family functioning and the way youth are managing the trauma they've been exposed to, substance abuse issues, school, work, all of those other areas, their thinking, their antisocial thinking, because their thinking leads to feelings, leads to negative behavior or positive behavior. All of those they're still moldable. You can influence all of those with the right treatment. And the research gives us even more information about how to do that. So not only now do you have this research we've done that says, hey, we're right here in Oregon, you have a lower group that commits a majority of the crime. We know that we can identify who's most likely to be there. And we know that by influencing those types of risks that you can impact, you can break that trajectory. Let's start to mold the system to match treatment and corrections. That's the next level of this that we took on, is statewide this was done. And the move to start to have treatment responses in addition to corrections. That's the key. It's not one or the other. It's not hard on crime, not soft on crime. It's smart on crime. It's using what you know about the youth, their family, their pathway to what we believe might happen, what we know has happened, and match treatment responses and corrections to help the youth leave the system with more skills than they came in with and help reduce victimization, and what we went on to find, help reduce costs.
Well, it's making me think of all those years that I co-facilitated a group at a youth corrections facility with folks who had been incarcerated for a violent crime. And in the public, those are the individuals that we usually think of when we think of juvenile justice. We think of the youth who make the headlines, right? That Major 11 type crimes. Those were the individuals I worked with. But that is the far end of the continuum on response. And so that was the piece I knew was the far end of the continuum. I think what most people think of. But in the conversations I've had with you since working with the center, is that is actually a small piece for a small piece of the population within the juvenile justice system. And a majority of the interaction is spent way before that, trying to get to that person, not to that part where they're in a correctional facility. And I'm wondering if you can spend some time talking about those responses that we don't typically think of and those diversion and deflection points for juvenile justice.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks for the question. Can I put it a little bit in historical context just so
Absolutely.
would have some background on it? Because you're absolutely right. That's such a good segue here, Chris. What does the public know about the juvenile justice system and what works and what doesn't? Where do we get even most of our information about the adult system and the way that it works, right? I mean, many people try to fill in that blank about the juvenile justice system as thinking of it as a mini me of the adult system, which it isn't. There's some things that are similar, some are different. But what do we know about how the adult correction system works, from law enforcement to arrest to court to jail to prison, is through mostly TV shows. I mean, that's what we have a lot of. Next to what happens in the hospital, it's what happens in the correction system. You went from Hawaii Five-O to Law and Order, Starsky and Hutch in there somewhere, to Breaking Bad and Orange is the New Black, right? I mean, that's the genesis of our education on corrections. Now, tell me a show, good, bad, or indifferent, they've represented kind of what happens in the process, dramatized it, but in sometimes very accurately what happens. So now think of, in the juvenile justice system, what show did you learn from? Where have we had a teenager, young adult, go from breaking the law to law enforcement to taking them to the juvenile justice system to seeing how that's processed to understanding what factors are taken into account to what happens in court, who goes, who doesn't? I've never seen one. Maybe I have seen, a Hill Street Blues refer to a juvenile probation officer in my archives of my TV land, or certainly how Andy and Mayberry successfully kept kids out. But I don't know that there is a good, commonly seen educational piece. So what does that do? It does the kinds of things you're talking about. It has some high profile, sometimes horrific delinquent cases grab the big headlines, and people assume that represents all juvenile offenders. And no doubt they are horrific, and the impacts in our communities and what we've seen of those crimes, I come upon with great reverence. That is part of what happens, and it's a very, very, very small part. What we don't see behind the portrayal of those individuals are the stories of all the successes within the juvenile justice system and how it works and how it's applied 40 years of research to successfully identify, treat, have corrections responses so a youth can live more successfully and reduce crime. Really, that's it. I mean, in brief history, although the history of juvenile justice is not brief, it goes back to the 1700s. I was not there. When I went back in my history of work, you notice, Chris, I didn't go back to those days to tell you who I worked with then and what my little brain was doing and who I got to work with, right? So it doesn't start at the 1700s, but juvenile justice does. If you go back to Europe, that's where our roots are. But looking just in our country, let's say from the 60s. So you've got the 60s to 80s, that 20-year block. Juveniles were seen as very innocent children, and that the crimes they were committing was a result of the poverty they were living in or social context. They were seen as victims themselves, and we needed to help them. That was the tone and the culture of juvenile offenders and the response to them in that time. And then the 80s to the 2000s, we'd had this tough on crime. The pendulum went the other direction. Juveniles were viewed as very serious threat to public safety, and laws started to transform public policy to respond to that threat, like Measure 11, like Hard Lock 'em Up. And then from 00 to 2020, we started to second guess that. First of all, it put a crunch on budgets that got a lot of people's attention. And unfortunately, not secondary to that was they found it wasn't as effective. That youth would leave the system committing more crimes because they had their formative years learning from other offenders. There's this big contagion factor around adolescence and crime. So we start to think coming into 2015, 16, something there, and saying, this isn't working. We have to do something different. Let's talk about what we know now as a balanced approach to responses. So we do hold youth accountable. We do provide restitution to victims. We do look at using detention when needed or home monitoring and probation and all those things, but it's matched with treatment and focusing on, again, responding to those areas of risk that put youth at greater jeopardy of committing more crimes. So we've moved from this thinking of them being very much a victim themselves to very much a threat. And now this balance of they do have issues going on, which perpetuate them into more crime. But if we just do a hug, you poor little thing, crime still goes up. If you just do treatment, crime still goes up. If you just lock youth up, crime still goes up. So you have to have a balance of the two. And that all led to where we currently are with corrections and treatment mixed. So how does that work then? What does the system look like in terms of applying that research? And they have across Oregon to what the system looks like. Well, you want to apply it in a couple different ways. First of all, you want to make sure that the response matches the level of threat. So if you do too much with a low-risk offender, you will increase crime. If you do too little with a high-risk offender, you will increase crime. The intensity of response needs to match the intensity of risk and intensity of the crime. So a big part of the juvenile justice system is trying to keep youth out of the system, as funny as that sounds. But here's what it's based on. Very, very rigorous and strong research that says the more they progress, the more they hang out with other juvenile offenders, the more delinquent they become. So if we can successfully manage them, we being the criminal justice system, if they can successfully be managed outside of juvenile court, that prevents that contagion factor of delinquency. And that doesn't mean if you have a very high-risk kid who needs a really strong response that you try to prevent it, you take them right to court. But the majority of youth, really, a high percentage of them are managed outside of juvenile court. So let's look at about 290 individuals. Let's just say 290 individuals who go in, they get the risk assessment. About 144 of them will be managed in a diversion basis. They are low-risk offenders. They're picked up for shoplifting, criminal mischief. They'll be told, you need to go to an anger management, you need to go to an anti-theft class, you need to go to this substance abuse treatment, and we will close your case if you successfully do all of that. 86% success rate in managing youth that way, by the way, for low-risk offenders. For those who are a little bit more high risk, it's still not moved to probation. Those are managed on what they call an informal accountability agreement, which puts in writing with the intake probation counselor from the juvenile justice system that says, I'm going to work with you for a while. And here are the things you need to do to get off of this FAA. If you escalate, then I'm going to take you to court. If we can successfully close this, your case is closed. So those kinds of things are, I'd say out of the 289, you might look at about 115 of individuals there being treated there. And then out of the 290, about 23 actually go to court. If you were to break this up, that's what the proportions would look like. That's because they're higher risk or the crime they've committed is so severe, regardless of the risk level, they have to go to court. And those are put under the jurisdiction of the court. Out of the 290, you'll probably have another 2 that go to the youth authority and are placed in residential treatment, and maybe another 2 or 1 or 2 that go to the youth correctional facility, which is akin to adult prison, but not really. It's a long-term lockup. It's a secure facility. They do get treatment there, but it's longer term. And then maybe another 1 or 2 of those will be remanded to the adult court for what they've done. So when you hear those numbers, even with a small n, you can see the majority are managed outside the court. And the first things we would say when I was a researcher, and they still do, of course, is saying, is that a good thing? I mean, we applied the research, but was that a good thing for our community? So with the recidivism study, what they can do and what we did do and they can continue to do is say, well, let's look at recidivism by decision point. Let's look at those youth who were managed in a class, just went to a class or 2. How many of them reoffended? About 86% do not. Of those on an FAA, how many reoffended? About 78 do not. Of those on probation, how many reoffended? And then they start to look like the typical recidivism data. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the research has been applied and you've had the system accountability to look at, did it work? And the data is saying, yes, you're putting the right kids in the right places. We're keeping crime down by doing that.
The piece I also want to talk about with that is what the treatment looks like. So I know in the adult system, when we talk about risk needs and responsivity, so for folks who I talk about risk needs and responsivity all the time. I can't help myself. Listeners, Ari and I can talk about this for hours. We will try to control ourselves. So we talk about the risk to commit another crime. The need is the treatment that is connected to the pieces of risk, and responsivity is the things that kind of get in the way and how someone responds to treatment. So in the adult system, when you're looking at risk, you look at the categories of risk and then the treatment where someone is high risk responds to those categories of risk. So if it's criminal thinking, for example, which is one you see a lot, so then there's cognitive behavioral therapy around criminal thinking, but it's done in a different way now than it used to be. So I guess those are my 2 questions. Is it connected to risk needs and responsivity with the adult system, with the treatment being targeted? And then I'd really like to talk about how the treatment itself has changed over the years, because what people think of with scared straight and everything else we found was not research-based. And so spending some time talking about how that treatment looks different and how things like scared straight can actually be problematic.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities with what your background has learned and helped to bring into the workforce around the risk needs and responsivity. And by that, I mean the cognitive behavioral. So, what I mentioned earlier, let's just say what it is. And so all that gets babble after a while, I think. Although you and I could probably do it through what's dinner, right?
Right.
Pizza and responsivity factors. So, you get a trigger of some kind, right? And it leads to some thoughts, which leads to feelings, which leads to behavior. So you, as a child, a teenager, hearing the father starting to yell at the mom in some situation where there's domestic violence, there's a thought, right? A feeling of not safe, worry for the mom, feelings of things they can't control. It's overwhelming. What's my behavior in an overwhelming situation? Well, I don't have the skills I need, so I'm going to get stoned and make this easier. I'm going to drink and I'm going to numb out. Situation leads to thoughts, leads to feelings, leads to behavior. And then when I'm stoned, I'm going to go and do whatever, steal something. This is the progression. So cognitive behavioral treatment that you were talking about helps to interrupt that. It helps youth understand that cycle of thinking to feelings to behavior, and at what point do they have control to start to change that? Well, you just don't get the control to change it, by the way. It just doesn't come because you read this out of a book. Hey, we're going to change your thinking so you feel better and you stop this stuff that scares everybody. Yes. In what world would that be true? Nor would I even think, we should be as arrogant to approach a young person's life in that manner. But in stages of change, you assess where youth is at, you motivate them to get involved, and you start to help them see that pattern and pick up things to change it. And what I meant when I was being a bit sarcastic there is it doesn't just change because they understand it, right? They still don't have that skills to use a different behavior. And so the cognitive behavioral curriculums, Thinking for a Change, for example, with youth, have hundreds of hours of role playing and testing new things and working together. So you build the response muscle the way an athlete builds a muscle, right? If you're teenagers, your young teens trying to learn to hit a baseball, you just don't hold up a chapter in a book and say, if you think about this differently, you'll hit it. You don't do that. No one even thinks about that. It is funny, right, Chris? You get in the batting cage with them, you show them how to hold it, you show them how you stand, you show them where to meet the ball, and they practice, practice, practice. The same thing with changing behavior and thinking patterns. You have to role play it enough so they start to build that muscle. And then there are programs, to get specifically to your question about the types of treatment, there are programs that help them practice it in the real world. So I'll tell you what I mean by that. A big risk factor for kids is family dynamics, right? That's one of the ones I mentioned. Domestic violence in the home or abuse, having an adult member in the adult system, high risk there, by the way. Having someone in home with substance abuse issues, having someone in home with mental health problems that aren't being managed. So they're out of control with that. And there's part of this work that we've done before when I was in the field with youth on probation who were going to cognitive behavioral training. And then there was a family component. So the parents also were getting skills as they were ready, if they were available. In some families, they weren't. Sometimes it meant working with the aunt or the grandma or who was a significant contact who was healthy enough to provide that supervision. So parents have their own continuum of healing, by the way. But this way, when something happened in the family, we could refer to, last week we talked about this in chapter 12, a different way to respond that doesn't lead to so much out of control anger. And the parents were also going through it. So we all had the same point of reference. And can we try it again? And the family would try it again, which seems a little rote, might even sound super awkward and silly, but they were invested in doing better. And there were ways we got to that investment, by the way. It didn't just happen. And when I say we, who did that work? So probation counselors were trained to provide the cognitive behavioral therapy, which was a huge rub for a while. You can't be the person who helps treatment and holds them accountable. And there was all this divisiveness and theorizing about how it would work or wouldn't. And we did work, we being practitioners in the field, the collective we, with people in the behavioral health world who knew those classes and could provide the training. So there was this triangle that was put together: juvenile justice, the youth and family, and then the treatment providers. And those three would work together to help them through that process of cognitive behavioral and how it would work, not just with the youth, but with the family or the guardian of the youth. And so practice, practice, practice. Other types of treatment that were very effective if youth were engaged in substance use. And for the most part, Chris, we're not talking about kids with high addiction issues. It did happen. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but for the most part, they were overusing and self-medicating to numb the pain in their life, and hadn't gotten to a high addictive quality yet, but were on that way. And that was the result when I say the pain in their life. And that's where I get into the studies around the ACEs studies, that is adverse childhood experiences. And that came out about the same time all of this was unfolding. So it was embedded in it, where we realized that a high rate of juveniles in the system and adults in the adult system were exposed to ongoing or horrific childhood trauma. So they were exposed to things like domestic violence in the home, abuse themselves, abuse on every level, physically, emotionally, sexually. There's just a list of 10 different areas and probably more of exposures to different kind of risk. And for some families, this was intergenerational trauma. I shouldn't say risk, intergenerational trauma. And so by the time they got to be 11, 12, 13, they're taking that hurt out in the world. Because what did we learn from the ACEs study? That it has long-term effects. I mean, years, 10, 20, 40 years, long-term effects on behavior and on health outcomes, mental health and physical health outcomes. And so in the teen years is where they start acting out. They can't put a name on the feelings they have. They can't identify why there's so much unrest inside, why it's so messy inside. They're struggling with things they've been exposed to that no one really ever should have, can't make sense of it as an adult, not to mention a preteen and a teenager. And so that manifests in negative behaviors and in self medicating. And so substance abuse treatment, that's trauma informed treatment is what's key when I talk about the treatment. Mental health treatment for youth who are experiencing anxiety, depression, PTSD, and other kinds of mental health conditions need a very trauma informed approach. So we're starting to bring in the behavioral health side of it with family treatment, with the cognitive behavioral. So if you just put a teenager in a cognitive behavioral class and they're trying to manage all their anxiety, if they've had a trauma exposure in their history, if they have a trauma organized brain, it's impossible to take that history that you're sitting with, sit in a class and digest information. Your mind can't connect. It can't go through logical 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from A to Z kind of thinking. It's you're distracted, disassociated, anxious, not being able to focus, concentrate, can't take in multiple things at the same time. So a responsivity, which is probably the hardest one for people to understand in the R&R, means helping someone get ready for the treatment that will help them to reduce crime.
The hardest thing to understand and the hardest part to say of the risk needs responsivity model. I have to remind myself every time responsivity. So hard to understand and rather hard to say. Everybody stumbles over it.
Both. And so when you talk to practitioners, you just lose them there. All right, I was tracking you with the risk. I was tracking you. It makes sense. Individuals who have experienced other stuff in their lives are more likely to reoffend. Makes sense. You can even prevent that. But you lost me at responsivity. You turned the corner and I got off and I'm going in and this big, it just is like, doesn't make sense. So in the best of ways to talk about it, which hopefully makes more sense, is that it's helping someone get ready for the treatment to help them. And for sometimes that might be a learning, they can't take it in written ways. So you have to figure out what's their learning style so they can understand it. That's responsivity, being responsive to their needs for learning. Let's say it's a language. They don't speak English. And so this class is not set up for them, or their culture isn't really about role playing. So that wouldn't fit for them. Or, as I said before, they're dealing with some impacts from trauma and they can't focus in class. So they're not ready for it. So you have to help manage those things first, or kind of simultaneously. They're usually done together. And then put in the cognitive behavioral or the mindfulness practices, which really help in both of those worlds.
I would also think other things that could possibly get in the way, especially with youth, would be things like food insecurity. If they're not able to have enough to eat, that if you're hungry, sitting in class and going to school is really difficult, or sitting through treatment and trying to engage in treatment would be really difficult. So sometimes it isn't even what we would think of as big things, right? Trauma, mental health issues. It can be things like learning style and, like you were talking about, and language barriers. And has this child eaten today? Did they have a safe place to sleep last night? Like, those are huge parts of it, I would imagine.
Significantly so. You're absolutely, you articulated that so just spot on again. Food insecurities, feeling hungry, you're not going to participate fully in a group. housing insecurities. Let me give you an example of this, what we call the social determinants of health, right? The things that impact our health that are in our communities. I once did a research study as a juvenile justice researcher on the impact of a residential substance abuse treatment facility. How effective was it at reducing crime? And looked at youth who were placed there, looked at their crime 3 years and 3 years after, before they went to treatment and 3 years after the treatment, and had a comparison and all of those important things in research. But the bottom line was, Chris, the research found that of all the youth in the cohorts that we studied, recidivism dropped off after 5 months of residential treatment. Didn't make a difference if they were there 6, 7, or 12. The post-recidivism was equally successful, 75% reduction in recidivism. And the threshold for exposure to treatment was at about 5 months. If you were there for less time, you didn't see that high of a reduction in crime. But if you were there for longer periods of time, it's not like you saw a greater reduction. That's what I mean by that. If you were there for 5, 6, or 12 months, all those groups had a 75% reduction in crime. So I was like, why don't we move them through? This is like taking the research and trying to apply it to policy. Why don't we try to move you through a little bit faster? Not cut off treatment they need, but there's a group of youth waiting to get in. And it's showing at 5 months, you have the same success rate as 12. And what we found out was the kids who were there longer is because they didn't have a place to live. So when you talk about housing insecurities or home not being safe for a youth, the juvenile justice system, where the biggest struggle is really not reducing crime. They're very successful. It's finding a place for young people to live and practice what they're learning. That's why our detentions are filled. A default place. That's why residential treatments are filled. I'm not saying they don't need to be locked up for some community safety issues, because those youth exist. But as you saw in the data earlier, it's less than 1% of all offenders. So we're overusing these residential facilities because there is no other place to put someone who is not a legal adult. Can't use the hotel version like they do with some homeless adults. And I'm not even saying that's a good thing, but they will look to those kinds of resources for housing. You add to youth that you're a minor, and they're clogging some of the residential pieces because in the end, there's just no other place for them.
I'm wondering too about that piece as I think back to our conversation about R&R, so the risk needs, but much easier to say. As I'm thinking about R&R and the contagion piece of it and having folks, even if they're in treatment, but they're staying in a place longer than they were intended to be for treatment. If there are some issues around that with the contagion of antisocial thinking and antisocial behavior with keeping folks in placement longer than they needed to be. If you're finally decreasing their R&R, is that counterintuitive with what's happening in keeping someone for too long?
Yeah, some of the best research internationally comes out of Oregon Social Learning Center that treats juveniles offenders individually in multidimensional foster care or therapeutic foster care. So you're not putting them in homes where there's a group of youth to expose each other to different negative thinking and behaviors and hey, let's try this, that kind of verbose talking that happens and egging each other on. So clearly the research around the individualized care and therapeutic foster care is the best. It has better outcomes, there's no doubt. Can every community afford that versus what we end up doing? And that's where it does come down to some economics. By scale of putting youth together seems to be, quote, easier. And some residential facilities, especially that are based on evidence-based practices, are starting not to mix or haven't mixed low, medium, and high risk youth. So that's helped. So if they have a wing of just this level of risk and don't mix youth that way, that helps in a residential facility. Or if they don't take low risk offenders, that helps definitely. The research says you should not intermingle these groups. Don't have them in a group together. Don't have them in treatment together. So residential facilities that do that don't have as much of an issue. They're already there. It's not so much contagion as it is keeping alike groups together. And when that's not possible, certainly the multidimensional foster care with the backup and therapeutic foster care, that makes a big difference in their lives. So to your question, yes, if not done right, they will leave committing many more crimes. If separated at risk level, that helps. If put in an environment that's highly supportive and offering them opportunities for treatment and support that they've never had, that's successful. If they can be in individualized, very supportive foster care situations, that can help too. There's a lot more hope than worry in juvenile justice. There's a lot more success than the horrific, horrendous headlines. And I don't mean to minimize the impact of those, because again, what we see on the news with some offenders and what we see in massive shootings is, I can't even begin to put words on how devastating that is. So I don't want to minimize, because it doesn't happen a lot, it's not a big deal. The impact is life altering for individuals taken from this world and their families changed forever. It's beyond heart wrenching. So we need a response and a prevention around that. And for the majority of other offenders, the room for change and reform and skill building and giving back to victims, which I haven't talked about very much here, through restorative justice, where they meet with victims based on victims who want to, it's a voluntary thing, and there's a mediator, and they start to connect with some empathy when they see impact, and that has very, very successful outcomes. So this system, this juvenile justice system, has put together from history all we know what works. They've invested in the training on it and the resources. They've applied the research in tools and in follow-up to make sure it's effective. They're looking at how to make the most with public dollars. And the data shows, and the personal lives show, and the reduction in victimization all show it's a highly effective system. If some of our physical health outcomes had the same outcomes as a juvenile justice system, they would make every front page, every news, oh, you had that disease, but you got out of it, you're okay. We'd be celebrating in the streets. And here you have a system that turns people's lives around and no one even knows how it's operating. There's a miss there, a huge disconnect, and a lot to learn from it. I also have worked, like you, in the adult system and have often heard from law enforcement, it's a broken system. That's another thing you'll hear about juvenile justice. It's broken. Everybody here started in juvenile justice. And they're right. Everyone in the adult system probably have a history. But what they don't see is everyone else who didn't end up there because we broke that trajectory. The system worked. And now in my career, where I saw that relationship between behavioral health and crime, I moved more into the behavioral health world and into where I landed at GOBHI. And now, of course, working under Karen Wheeler, who is our CEO. Again, right place, right leadership, right skills. That's saying, let's do things like this. Let's look at the adult system through your center, Chris, that you manage so wonderfully. Let's have me and the team continue to do what we know works and helping people understand what's going on in the juvenile justice system. It's just this whole life of being really, really blessed with right place, right time, and right things happening, because now the juvenile justice system is looking, we need a more collaborative relationship with behavioral health. Really understanding the ACEs impact. They're really understanding that the impact of behavioral health on responsivity and on being able to be effective in treatment. So all of that is converging at the same time.
Thank you for joining us today for our conversation with Ari Wagner, Chief Operating Officer for GOBHI and Director of Operations. We had so much to talk about that we ended up breaking up the episode into 2 episodes. Please join us next time for part 2. The Center Collaborative is a production of the Oregon Center on Behavioral Health and Justice Integration, a specialized division of Greater Oregon Behavioral Health Incorporated. It is produced by me, Chris Thomas, with production assistance from Patrick Kennedy. Music by Patrick Mulvihill and Patrick Kennedy. Subscribe to the Center Perspective using your favorite app. To learn more about criminal justice and behavioral health in Oregon, visit the Center's website at OCBHJI.org. You can also find us on Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. Please reach out to us. Join us next time as we chat with the experts about programs and partnerships at work within this complex and yet compelling field.